Please join in a spirit of meditation, reflection, or prayer as we deepen into our service and share our opening words for this morning. The universe is immense and gorgeous and magnificent. I salute it. Every speck, every little fly on the window salutes the universe. Every leaf has meaning. I think the universe is expanding. It is experiencing and accomplishing. And we have the opportunity to add to its glow. Everybody can love in the place where you are, in the physical body in which you are, in the life in which you are involved. We can all add our share of love without leaving the room. As we light this chalice, may it serve to give us clarity of purpose and illuminate our way as we set about doing the work of this congregation, in commitment, in cooperation, and in love.
So I first preached a version of this sermon in Oregon. When a congregant asked me what the sermon for the coming week was going to be about, I said, Substitutionary Atonement and Asymmetrical Risk. And she replied rather facetiously, "Oh, I'll be sure to be there." And I said, "Yeah, you can never say enough about this stuff." We were having fun, but I do think substitutionary atonement and asymmetrical risk are pretty foundational to what is being played out in our society right now. So let's start with substitutionary atonement. The story is told in the Christian tradition that Adam and Eve fell from grace, and from then on, humans were full of sin and beyond redemption. And then Jesus came along and took on all the sins of humanity and died a terrible death. And through his death, the story goes, he gave humanity a path to salvation, a way to be redeemed. And this is called substitutionary atonement. Someone pays so that others don't have to. Jesus paid in lieu of humanity, and the story concludes with the idea that as long as people accept his sacrifice and his atonement on their behalf, they have access to redemption. Like many Christian ideas, substitutionary atonement is woven over time into Western culture in ways that I'm sure the early Christians couldn't have imagined, just as we cannot know the unintended consequences of our lived religion hundreds of years into the future. But this kernel, substitutionary atonement, is an especially insidious and destructive practice we have all inherited because of the way it plays out in the world. And this is where asymmetrical risk comes in. Asymmetrical just means that something is not the same on both sides of the line. And in this case, I'm meaning something is not balanced. Simply put, it means that those in the dominant culture, especially those with wealth and power, do not bear the consequences of their actions, but somebody does. We have integrated the idea into our psyches in a way that costs can be externalized, that another can bear them for us. Now we let certain groups of people bear those costs and shoulder the risks of our societies. So let me give you a few examples. One way to organize and talk about the world is to reference the global north and the global south. The global north includes all the highly industrialized countries of the world, such as South Korea, the United States, Australia, Taiwan, Japan, Israel, and many Western European countries. The global south includes most of the countries in Asia, South America, Africa, and most of the island countries. The global north has generally enjoyed great prosperity and economic growth. This was possible in part because we had abundant and cheap energy in the form of fossil fuels. Burning fossil fuels floods the atmosphere with carbon dioxide and contributes significantly to catastrophic climate change. But the consequences of climate change fall more heavily on the global south and marginalized people, even though they did not contribute much to creating the problem. Environmental economist Liz Stanton said in an interview, "We are all in the same boat, but some are on the first-class deck and some are in steerage. If the ship sinks, everyone is in big trouble. We only have, as they say, one Earth." She continues, "Short of total climate disaster, however, we have the incremental degradation of natural environments and the well-being of the communities that rely on them the most. Richer families can protect themselves with houses outside of flood zones, air conditioning, and access to high-cost foods and private water supplies. Poorer families are more vulnerable to severe weather, losses of natural resources, and the limitations on the supply of food and water. Environmental writer and politician Al Gore talks about environmental degradation, saying, "Every storm is different now." This has been apparent in the superstorms of the past decade. Hurricane Irma was the most powerful Atlantic hurricane in recorded history. It was a Category 5 storm when it made landfall in Barbuda in 2017, and its winds were 185 miles per hour for 37 hours. Typhoon Haiyan was one of the most powerful tropical cyclones ever recorded. On making landfall, Haiyan devastated portions of Southeast Asia, particularly the Philippines. It was the deadliest Philippine typhoon on record, killing at least 6,300 people in that country alone. It is understood that climate change slows these types of storms, causing them to linger longer over land, dumping more water. The Philippines and Barbuda had little to do with creating the climate crises, but they bear the costs. This is asymmetrical risk. We also see the impacts on marginalized people closer to home in the wake of storms. In Louisiana, Puerto Rico, Florida, people living on the margins face the devastation and loss of housing with few or no resources to cope. Think the Ninth Ward in Katrina. So the global North benefits from the fossil fuel economy, and the global South and marginalized people assume the risks and pay the costs. The global North externalizes the costs of their prosperity, at least until the ship sinks. Prosperity in the United States also rests on cheap labor. Much of our initial economy was created at the expense of enslaved peoples. In his book, Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates writes, "At the onset of the Civil War, our stolen bodies were worth $4 billion, more than all of American industry, all of American railroads, workshops, and factories combined. And the prime product rendered by our stolen bodies, cotton, was America's primary export. The richest men in America lived in the Mississippi River Valley, and they made their riches off our stolen bodies. So slaveholders reaped the benefits, but enslaved people shouldered the risks and paid the costs." In another example, journalist Raina Kalick writes, "There is one group of American workers so disenfranchised that corporations are able to get away with paying them wages that rival those of third world sweatshops. These laborers have been legally stripped of their political, economic, and social rights and ultimately relegated to second-class citizens. They are banned from unionizing, violently silenced from speaking out, and forced to work for little or no wages. This marginalization renders them practically invisible, as they are kept hidden from society with no available recourse to improve their circumstances or change their plight. Who are these disenfranchised group? They are the 2.3 million American prisoners locked behind bars where we cannot see or hear them, and they are modern-day slaves of the 21st century. Again, those that benefit and profit from this labor do not bear the risks or the costs. Those are borne by prisoners and their families." I think North Dakota has some pretty clear examples of asymmetrical risk and who has the power to determine where pipelines run and who bears the risks if they leak. We have talked about asymmetrical risk and substitutionary atonement and looked at examples, and I hope the terms are less daunting now. What do these things look like even closer to home? Dare we ask what they look like in this room? So I've noticed a pattern in Unitarian Universalist congregations. When we are presented with a dangerous opportunity, like becoming a sanctuary church or the fiscal agent for a men's cold weather shelter, our thoughts often turn to practical matters. We want to know about codes and zoning and whether our insurance will cover us if something goes wrong. We speak about fiscal responsibility and being stewards of resources. We consider our obligations to those coming behind us to keep the organization intact. And these are good and right and reasonable concerns. We do have obligations and responsibilities. And I think the concerns over things like our insurance coverage are also a pretty good metaphor. What we are really wrestling with is risk. We are asking if we can minimize or eliminate risk. We want assurance and insurance that we will be okay. But what if the answer is no? There is no assurance or insurance, and we will have to assume the risk ourselves. Do we decline to do the work? And if we are not willing to assume the risk, what happens next? In our country, we have designated risk takers. They are called marginalized people, people of color, people living in poverty, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, refugees, undocumented immigrants, and so on. These are the people who assume the risks and/or pay the costs in lieu of the wealthy, the powerful, and the dominant group. They don't get a choice in whether they will assume these risks and costs, but somebody has to. This is white supremacy culture in a nutshell. The dominant group can decide that the risk is too high, the costs are too dear, and choose to sit this one out. Inherent in this choice is that there will need to be a substitute to pay the costs. When the fellowship opts to forego risk, we opt for it to be taken up by someone else. It is likely to fall back onto marginalized people. When we weigh our responsibilities then, we need to consider to whom are we responsible, with whom are we in covenant, and what future are we stewarding? If we decide that the work of solidarity with Indigenous people or the LGBTQIA community is too risky for us, then the costs and risks sit entirely on the shoulders of those two communities. If we decide that anti-racism work makes us feel too overwhelmed, that it exhausts us, we are deciding that people of color need to bear the full burden of systemic racism. Whenever we decide not to shoulder risks and costs, we leave it for someone else to do. This year, we are doing more internal work around decolonizing. If we are white, we are becoming more aware of what that means. But even as we do this internal work, there are always invitations to join the larger work. Since I've been here, North Dakota gave the green light for their part to approve almost doubling the oil pumping through the Dakota Access Pipeline. You know that that oil will end up as CO2 in the atmosphere, deepening our climate crises. We learned about a missing Indigenous woman, Cara Maui, and we learned a little more about that rampant problem. Some of us supported changing the name of Custer Park, a failed effort after this week, and some of us supported resettling refugees in Bismarck. We hosted the first LGBTQIA potluck on Friday, and we'll soon host a game night for the teens. It's interesting to think about all these issues in terms of costs, risks, and benefits. How does the dominant culture benefit from maintaining their power in each of these arenas? We talked recently about being vulnerable, acknowledging that being vulnerable is part of being courageous. We have also talked this year about being religious, defining religion as re-seeing or reconnecting. So where does substitutionary atonement and asymmetrical risk fit into our understanding about what it means to be a vulnerable and religious people? How are we called to engage with our Indigenous, refugee, and queer kin? How are we called to engage in the climate crises? What risks are we willing to shoulder? As we decide how we spend each day, how much risk and burden are we leaving to other people, and how much are we taking on? And what does it say about asymmetrical risk in the latitude we are accorded to answer that question? Unitarian Universalists have concerned themselves over the years with sharing the benefits. We have fought for equal housing opportunities, equal employment opportunities. We have worked to give people equal access to education and abortion. We have fought hard for equality to the best of our understanding. But I think we've missed half of the equation. We must also consider paying some of the costs and taking on some of the risks. Will this mean embracing a different standard of living? Will it mean risking our building? Will it mean being willing to be arrested? Will it mean doing what we are asked to do in our ally roles? When we take an active role, like showing up at the water protectors camp, I think this changes our relationship to the work. We are invested. If we too have something at stake, the work becomes something harder to turn away from. We are also better allies when we are not safe on the sidelines, but are sharing some small portion of the risk. Our level of commitment changes. Sister Simone Campbell calls this walking towards trouble. When I am thinking about taking a risk, I often go with my gut response, which is almost always to do what seems right to do. I think I can do this because I have a deep faith in us. I know we are strong, resilient, and capable people, and I trust that collectively we can handle almost anything that comes our way. We do not take risks alone. Some of us are here just to be fed and nourished on Sunday morning, and that is all we can manage right now. And I'm grateful that we have that here. But most of us can involve ourselves a little bit more. As we wrestle this year with the opportunities that knock on our door, I invite you to wade in without perfect assurance or insurance. I invite you to think about what the world would look like if we did not externalize the costs of our lives. What would it look like to walk toward trouble? And I extinguish our chalice with these words by Maya Angelou. Hope and fear cannot occupy the same space. Invite one to stay. Go in peace.